What is the coast? Is it just the beach? Or the marshes where there is no beach? Or is it more than that? How about the towns and cities along Highway 90? Or the towns and cities that branch up the feeder routes inland? If so, how far inland is it still the coast? Well, all depends on your definition of coasts. Technically, the coast is where the water meets the land. But ideologically, coastness is more than a physical place. It's a feeling, state of mind, an attitude. The coast is something people are more than where they are. But it all stems from the where the imagination runs wild in the old pines and oaks and sand and water.
Growing up at Shearwater Pottery was about the best childhood any human being ever had. We all had little canoes, little pirogues that my uncle Peter had built for us. So we would chase each other up and down the bayous and under the piers in the harbor in those little pirogues. We had a tree house that you could sleep in. I built an underground fort at one time. The most remote place on the pottery was a place that we called Fairyland. And we would go to Fairyland and drink wine out of little acorn goblets, and pick up the leaves that have molded away so that there's nothing but the lacy veins left of the leaves. Those were our fairy garments that were cast aside.
Now, that's an example of the where being more than just a mere place, the Gulf Coast being more than just sand and water, but of the place being the author of a state of being, a mindset. And that's what heritage tourism's all about. It's picking out the places that created the culture, the physical backdrop, the canvas on which life is painted, the places that define why this place is this way. The culture of the coast is unique. It's influenced by many factors. The Gulf and the seafaring life lived at the water for sure, but more neighboring areas, New Orleans and the Creole culture to the west, big city Mobile to the east, the endless piney woods to the north, they all blend here on the coast. There are elements of the mindsets of each adopted here, but we've put our own spin on life too, from the hurricanes we've endured, the living we've extracted from the Gulf, the people who've come here, the places they built and lived in or worked in and left for us to remember who they were and what they were. Here's some of those places and how they fit together to define not only where the coast is, but what it is. And where do we start? Well, at the beginning. Now, that beginning was a long time ago. The date lost, the date when the first human first saw the Gulf waters. We have some of the names they left behind, Biloxi, Pascagoula, and some of the names of some of the rivers that leave tourists baffled for an intelligible pronunciation, and rivers that have preserved tales otherwise forgotten. The second beginning for the coast came at a distinct place and time.
Well, in 1699, the King of France instructed Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville to come to this area and secure the mouth of the Mississippi River. He couldn't secure the mouth of the river, so he decided to make his location here in what is now present-day Biloxi and the Ocean Springs area. First thing he did was built a fortification, and over time they decided to bring settlers in, so they settled along the Biloxi Bay, the Pascagoula River area, and some later on some would move into the Bay St. Louis Pass Christian area. But that was the three main settlements over time that began to develop and mature into what we see today.
And some of what we can see today dates back to that early French era. The La Pointe Krebs House is witness to it. It's the oldest standing structure in the Mississippi Valley. It was extensively damaged by Hurricane Katrina, and 11 years after, is still undergoing renovation. But the museum next door finally opened its doors again in 2016.
We covered things all the way from the first people here and the Native Americans, as well as the explorers, into colonial times, and work our way around almost up to modern times, covering things like livelihood, as well as a big section on the house and, you know, the interpretive aspects of the house, architecturally, historically, all that. But we try to cover a little bit of everything in the area.
Little Point Krebs House sits overlooking a body of water connected to the nearby Pascagoula River. The Pascagoula plays heavily into the lore of the coast and is a unique river for its size in America. The Pascagoula Audubon Center in nearby Moss Point interprets the river and its association to the culture of the coast.
So it's the longest free-flowing river in the contiguous 48 states. So it's about 88, I've heard 88 and I've heard 82 miles in length. That means no dams. The water is sort of allowed to do what the water would do naturally. So we have species that are endemic to the Pascagoula, which means they're not found anywhere else on the planet. You could go to the river next door, where you're not going to find some of these species.
And the Pascagoula River has another attribute. It sings, or at least it used to. The singing stems from an old Native American legend. I've heard tales of decades ago, cars pulled over on Highway 90 to listen because the river sang so loudly. That was before rolled-up windows because of air conditioning and satellite radios blaring.
So it's said that on warm, clear, calm nights in the summer, you can still hear that music. So,
You ever heard it?
I have not. Some of my coworkers say they have.
The Pascagoula is wide and marshy, where it broadens before entering the Gulf of Mexico. But immediately upstream, it's mysterious and flanked by almost impenetrable cypress swamps. And on upriver, in George County, where the Pascagoula forms, just north of the abandoned Merrill Bridge, at the confluence of the Leaf and Chickasahee rivers, the banks are steep clay, and the river is deep into the piney woods. The piney woods has its own culture, hewn from the tenacity of the settlers who came here, many from the Carolinas. They brought their ways with them. Loosedale has preserved two of the leftovers from the early formative era, the restored one-room county line schoolhouse, demonstrative of the increasing value placed on education following the Civil War years, and next to the schoolhouse, the old county jail, first used in Merrill and then in Loosedale all the way up into 1960. The juxtaposition's not an accident. The message is, if you don't want to wind up here, you have a better chance of not doing so if you apply yourself in the schoolhouse. Loosedale's developing a lot of greenway spaces with walking trails and public use facilities, and the old school and jail are part of the development area. There's a homespun wisdom in the fiber of the Piney Woods section of the coastal heritage area, and an order to life, preserved in places like courthouses, and revered in recognized historic areas of the old towns like Wiggins, where the roots of the town and the county are engraved in stone, well, in mosaics at least, in Blaylock Park. And one of America's baseball heroes is buried in nearby Bond, Dizzy Dean, legend of the St. Louis Cardinals. Pitcher there back in the 1930s, and then after that, a television personality. When you think of travel associated with the coast, the first thing that comes to mind may be boats and ships. Although that's what brought the first explorers from Europe here, the train has played a huge role in the development and settlement of the coastal counties. Now, at first, trains primarily haul things out of the area. Timber, the huge virgin longleaf pine trees harvested here helped build America. Special locomotives were used like this one in Picayune. They didn't move very fast, but they could haul hundreds of tons of logs at a time. And timber products were also manufactured and shipped from here, tung oil and turpentine mostly. Tank car after tank car left the coastal counties with what we harvested from our forest. Hurricane Camille pretty much ended the tung oil industry when it destroyed the tung nut groves, plus by then it could be made artificially. And the great plantations of trees left behind found a new purpose, like at the Crosby Arboretum in Pearl River County.
The Arboretum is a living memorial to L.O. Crosby Jr. We're a great example of a low-maintenance facility. We're divided into roughly 2/3 of our site is young forest. The savannas at the Arboretum are absolutely gorgeous in the summertime, and we have a pitcher plant bog, several pitcher plant bogs.
Although nature's the main attraction at the Crosby Arboretum, many people stop by to see the architecture.
The Pine Coat Pavilion was designed by Arkansas architect Fay Jones, and he received an honor award from the American Institute of Architects, which is the highest honor in its field, and it is a Mississippi landmark.
Architecture of all types makes the coast what it is, and from all periods, antebellum through modern. One of the interesting examples is in Ocean Springs, long nicknamed the Frank Lloyd Wright House.
We are in the Charnley Norwood home in Ocean Springs, also known as Bon Celine. The architect was Louis Sullivan, who was the father of the skyscraper, and Louis Sullivan vacationed in Ocean Springs. The house burned in 1895, and Louis Sullivan was like, great, I can improve on my last design. Frank Lloyd Wright was an apprentice for Sullivan. It's not uncommon. The apprentice would take on a lot of the duties. You can tell it was an early prairie style, which Frank Lloyd Wright became known for.
Another example of architecture that attracts tourists to the Gulf Coast is the George Orr Museum, designed by Frank Gehry. The pods are envisioned to fit in with and dance beneath the live oaks surrounding them. But another stop on our heritage tourism list is a modest frame house on the street just north of the museum.
This is the Pleasant Reed Interpretive Center. We call it the Interpretive Center because the original house was here on the property, but it got destroyed in Hurricane Katrina. We've rebuilt it. It was a very traditional kind of Biloxi architecture shotgun home that was built by Pleasant Reed in the late 1880s. Pleasant was an emancipated slave. His family came down to the coast after the Civil War. He was a successful craftsman down here. It's 3 main rooms. There's the main area, which was Pleasant and his wife's room. There was a room for the girls, and then there's the kitchen. The house was originally built in 2 separate spaces. The kitchen was detached, and then when Biloxi got running water in the early 20th century, they moved the kitchen and added it to the house. I think it's a great just kind of glimpse into the past of what it was like to live in Biloxi about 100 years ago.
Unfortunately, in Katrina, we had over 160 landmark buildings. We lost 60 out of that 160. But since then, other buildings have been added to that list, so that list is growing again. Some of the ones that did survive was like the old Spanish house, which is right in this complex area we're in. The Fortage house, which we're in right now, on Mary Mahoney's is located, that was built in about 1835. The old Spanish house was built about 1840. We also have the Creole cottage, which was built in somewhere between 1830 and 1840 by John Deloney, there's a street named in Biloxi for Mr. Deloney, and he built these cottages for an investment into rent. And one of those cottages was turned into the first Biloxi library, and that library has been preserved as well. And then we have the second library that was built. It's also preserved and was built in around 1908.
Some of the places preserved are associated with one of the first big industries on the coast, other than seafood, tourism. Many of the grand hotels have been lost to time and storms.
By the mid-1800s, we found that hotels were being built along the Gulf Coast to accommodate the rich planters from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, as well as the elite of New Orleans. That was the group that was appealed to at first. And many of those began to build summer homes along the Gulf Coast. One of the first hotels was the Magnolia Hotel, which sits in this area we're sitting in.
One of the most famous landmark houses on the coast, actually more famous for who lived here last, was first created as a vacation home by an upstate planter, the national landmark Beauvoir.
Beauvoir was built by a fellow named James Brown, who had plantations up in the Delta. This was sort of his coastal retreat, and basically built this property. He had an orange orchard here, and his original title for it was Orange Grove. Ultimately, it came into the possession of a very famous writer in Mississippi who was a very close friend of Jefferson Davis, and she offered to him to come and stay as her guest to begin writing his memoirs. And so he did. We have two cottages that flank the home. They were built at the same time the home was built. And he took up residency in the farthest east cottage and wrote his memoirs there, The Rise and Fall of the Confederacy. Basically, then he fell in love with the place and began negotiations with her to purchase it, and ultimately made one payment, and then she got sick and passed on and left it to him in her will. Many people come to see the beautiful architecture of the home itself and of that style, up on, with wraparound porches and a beautiful view of the coast. I'm sure some people are aware of the history of the property. They come here. We have a beautiful museum and tell the story of the building of the house and of the various owners and of Jefferson Davis's stay here.
So tourism and vacationing were the origins of some of the coast heritage landmarks. In fact, whole towns, or for that matter, the whole coast grew because folks elsewhere needed an escape now and again. And the coast was and is a convenient place for them to go.
Bay St. Louis was discovered in 1699, named after King Louis XIV. We're standing in front of the historic train depot. It was built in 1928, but it has seen many New Orleans families come and go for the summers over the years. It's seen veterans, World War I, World War II, come and go over the years. This property is condemned, was filmed here in 1965-66. Robert Redford, Natalie Wood, Charles Bronson were in it.
Bay St. Louis has adopted some of the New Orleans culture in the way they bury their dead, or at least partly adopted it anyway. There's a mixture of below and above ground interments here. Now, they have to be above ground in New Orleans because the water table is so high. It's more of a cultural thing here, not a necessity.
But here in Bay St. Louis, at that elevation, we're about 26 feet above sea level. So great-grandmother did it and you decided to continue on with the tradition, or it was a sign of wealth. I have enough money I can afford to bury my loved ones above ground.
St. Mary's Cemetery is located right beside a historic church building in Bay St. Louis, St. Rose de Lima African American Catholic Church. The church was dwindling a few decades ago when the priest hit on a great idea. The best way to reconnect families to the church was to have them reconnect with each other.
It took them a year, but every Sunday for one of the families would get up once a month and they would tell their story. And at the end of the year, they found out that the Labatts were related to the Favres, who were related to Lozannas.
Now the family tree at St. Rose de Lima is a feature wall at the front of the sanctuary. And people from all over the coast, of all races and all denominations, visit every time the church doors are open. Another cultural tie Bay St. Louis has with New Orleans is this building. It was, and once again is, a dance hall, as well as a residence today. But in the day, the 100 Men Debating Benevolent Association Hall regularly had New Orleans talent like Fats Domino playing here.
Because of the proximity of the Bay St. Louis to New Orleans, that was the sound that was played here. It was whatever the popular music of the day was in New Orleans. So first it was jazz that was played here, or Dixieland even, and then it went into sort of the jump blues, and then it went into R&B, and then it went into soul, and then Percy Sledge played here, and so it kind of evolved as the music evolved.
The building's been lovingly and carefully restored and put back into commission after it was almost a total loss in Hurricane Katrina. Downtown Bay St. Louis, as well as nearby Pass Christian, was in the same shape, total devastation after Katrina. But what's here today is a testament to the people of the area who didn't give up, but who stayed and rebuilt the town to what it is today. And many will tell you it's better now than it was then. Waveland, to the west of Bay St. Louis, was where the eye of Katrina came ashore in Mississippi. For blocks inland, there were only slabs and piles of debris. Katrina's documented in the first government building inland that stood, housing now the Ground Zero Museum.
The architect who did the renovation, was in charge of renovation, was Allison Anderson, and she put in a wonderful timeline that shows starting August 23rd when the Katrina was in the Gulf and coming this way, and then it goes around and shows the aftermath, and she also has the water line.
To say that the lives of coast residents have been affected by the storms of the past would be an understatement, and also affected by the threat of another one that could happen at any time. And maybe that's a part of the attitude of the coast. Seize the day. It's reflected in celebrations like Mardi Gras, immortalized in museums like the train depot in Bay St. Louis and the old Magnolia Hotel in Biloxi. But there's one storm survivor on the coast that's seen them all and is an inspiration and a beacon, literally.
The Biloxi Lighthouse. The Biloxi Lighthouse was built in 1848. Now, amazingly, it survived Camille being severely damaged, and it survived Katrina, which are two major storms, and of course the 47 storm. So it's a structure well worth seeing, and there is tours in it, so it gives people an opportunity to go to the top and be able to get a bird's eye view of Biloxi.
The coast has its strong personalities, like Walter Anderson, the eccentric artist whose legacy and influence wasn't remotely understood until after his death. That's when treasures like his hundreds of watercolors he painted while on remote Horn Island were discovered, hidden away in a trunk in his little room. The room, now an integral part of the Walter Anderson Museum in Ocean Springs.
But he made his money through working at Shearwater Pottery with his two brothers, Peter and Mac. So the Anderson family has had an impact in this community for a long time. And their belief was to have beautiful original art at an affordable price.
Peter Anderson was the founder of Shearwater Pottery. Now, later generations of Andersons carry on the tradition of their elders.
We haven't gone production. We still make the pottery, just the two potters up there, so the quality's still there. It's functional, so the prices are reasonable. If you compare us to other potters, I think you'll find that we have reasonable prices. Plus, we have that broad mix of the decorative ware and the functional ware.
Mary C. O'Keefe, educator, the first woman superintendent of education in Mississippi, leaves her legacy of teaching and learning in the Mary C. O'Keefe Cultural Center in Ocean Springs. It's affectionately called simply the Mary C.
And we are the center of arts, education, and history for the city of Ocean Springs.
Present-day personalities carry on, but in their own footsteps. For instance, Bob Mahoney carrying on the tradition of his mother, Mary Mahoney, at her famous restaurant, the oldest house in Biloxi, but in his own way.
Like I tell everybody, when everybody else is having fun, I'm working. When everybody else is working, I'm having fun.
But the coast itself has its own personality. Much of it pertains to the sea. Much of that documented in the Maritime and Seafood Industry Museum.
I think they will come away with a broader sense of just how hard it was to make a living in the seafood industry, and that's what built Biloxi and the Gulf Coast.
The Gulf Coast, with the personality that may have shades borrowed from nearby cultures, but shaped and oftentimes returned those cultures modified. For example, Mardi Gras wouldn't be Mardi Gras without a king cake from Paul's Pastries in Picayune, Mississippi. The coast is rooted in what brought people here to begin with, the sea, and what's kept them here, seafood and logging and tourism. But it isn't all behind us either. The spirit and tenacity of the coast is intertwined with the space program, the testing of rockets in Hancock County, illustrated in the museum just off I-10. Rockets that will someday take people to Mars. All of it being done here today because we've had a heritage of it being done before. It's the intangible spirit of the coast that you see in the artifacts around you, but you can feel that spirit too.
The best way I can describe it is one of my sons, one time when we asked him if he'd like to go off to college, he said, "I ain't going off to college." I said, "Why?" "There's no water." I think people on the Gulf Coast have salt in their veins, and it's the best way to describe it. The salt is in the air. We breathe it, so we understand what it is, and we relish it. And I think that's what you have when you have coast people. Just like everybody's loyal to their city, we're loyal to the coast.
That's it, maybe. That taste of the coast is the salt air. It's an apt metaphor for the spirit that permeates life here, just like the air, and lifts inland a county or so every afternoon on the sea breeze. The pen of a poet could perhaps capture that spirit and why it reveres the places that are here that gave that spirit its birth. The places you've just seen, and hundreds more like them, hard to describe them all. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, a visit to the Gulf Coast Heritage Area is worth 1,000 pictures. And to breathe the salt air for yourself is to make that spirit a part of yourself. A spirit that admires beauty and nature and honors those who were here before and those who will come after. And the spirit that doesn't give up, but always comes back better than ever. That's the heritage of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Now, that and good food. For information on over 135 heritage locations in South Mississippi, including their accessibility, go to www.disabilityconnection.org.